From the Cronkite studios in downtown Phoenix, this is Cronkite News.
Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Cronkite News on Arizona PBS. I'm Marcella Bayeto. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we take a look at the top stories from the politics team, to the arrest of the Maricopa County assessor, to the factors that make Arizona a swing state.
Our big story tonight, Maricopa County assessor Paul Peterson, accused of human smuggling in an adoption fraud scheme. Good evening. I'm Madison LaBerge.
And I'm Daria Yasmin. Thank you for joining us. Peterson faces 62 charges across Arizona, Utah, and Arkansas, 32 of which originate in Arizona. Authorities say Peterson ran an adoption law practice in Mesa for years, bringing women from the Marshall Islands to the U.S. to give birth.
Ellie Nakamoto-White is standing by with what supposedly would happen once the women were here. Ellie?
Peterson's arrest has been sending shockwaves across Arizona. The respected lawyer and public servant was taken into custody last night, while officials today broke down the details of the case against him.
An indictment has been filed against you. It is charging you with one count of conspiracy, a Class 2 felony, one count of fraudulent schemes, that's booked as a Class 2 felony.
Maricopa County Assessor Paul Peterson was arrested last night after officials allege Peterson has been involved in an international adoption fraud scheme since at least 2015. Peterson has been indicted along with Linwood Jeanette, a woman authorities say was his helper. They have been charged with 32 felony counts in Arizona, Utah, and Arkansas.
What we've alleged and what we've discovered is that this adoption fraud schemes involves pregnant women from the Marshall Islands being flown to the state of Arizona to have their babies put up for adoption.
According to the indictment, Peterson, who was an adoption lawyer licensed in Arizona, flew dozens of women from the Marshall Islands to Utah and Arizona to give birth. Investigators say they believe the women participated in the fraud scheme, some of them unaware of the extent of the crime they were involved in. Peterson allegedly housed them and promised them $1,000 a month while they were pregnant in the U.S. Court documents also show Peterson falsely claimed the women were Arizona residents so they could receive Medicaid health coverage. Authorities are now charging Peterson with over $800,000 worth of fraud. Officials say that number is expected to rise.
It is alleged that Mr. Peterson would charge about $35,000 for you to adopt a child from his agency.
Our focus is on the individuals, these two specific individuals who have allegedly abused the system and ripped off Arizona taxpayers.
Authorities say the alleged scheme violates the Compact of Free Association international agreement between the U.S. and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. While Marshall Island citizens are allowed to travel to the U.S. without a visa, it does ban travel for adoption purposes. Today wanted to be very clear in saying that they are not going after the families involved and will not interfere with adoptions that have already taken place. Peterson is currently being held on a $500,000 bond. His next court appearance is set for October 15th. Live in the studio, Ellie Nakamoto-White, Cronkite News.
As we mentioned, the adoption scheme involved mothers from the Marshall Islands.
So now let's dig deeper. Why this place? Well, there's a long, tragic history involved.
In the 40s and the 50s, the U.S. tested nuclear weapons on the Marshall Islands. The radioactive materials left behind caused health problems. Even today, some of the islands are uninhabitable. To make up for that, in 1986, the U.S. compensated the islands financially and opened its borders to Marshallese immigrants, allowing them to work in the U.S. without a visa. According to an article in the New Republic, in the 1990s, there was a surge in international adoptions. With relaxed visas, the Marshall Islands became somewhat of an easy place to adopt children. But in 2001, a study done by BYU found that 87% of Marshallese mothers who gave up their children for adoption believed their children would return home once they reached 18. It's common practice in the islands for others to help raise children. It's like adding another family in marriage. The families join and stay in touch. The adoptions in the U.S. are closed, with many of the mothers never to see their children again. To try and stop this, the Marshall Islands Adoption Act of 2002 made it illegal to solicit a baby for adoption through financial incentive. Now all adoptions must be completed inside the country and approved by its courts. After these allegations surfaced, several parents who have adopted children are voicing their concerns.
With often little knowledge of their adopted child's biological parents, many parents are left to wonder, was my son or daughter trafficked before I adopted them? So Cronkite News dug even deeper. Local Arizonan mom Julie Todd Brokaw knew she wanted to adopt when she was just 19 years old.
Biggest worry was you'd see these stories where the family wants the kid back and courts were overturning the adoptive rights, and so this poor child was being returned home to people they didn't actually know but were their biological family. And I knew right then I wanted no part of that. And so that's the reason we pursued the international adoption route.
Brokaw adopted her son from Seoul, Korea almost 23 years ago. She says that it cost her about $5,000 for the entire process.
Since then, that same exact adoption would be a much more expensive price.
She says that she never worried about if her son was trafficked, but said other parents may be.
You know, the normal wonderings were, maybe my parent was wealthy or famous, maybe that movie star's my mom or dad, you know, where now it's like, oh my word, what if I was human trafficked?
Brokaw says prospective adoptive parents need to gather the most information that they can.
It is definitely a hard situation for families looking to expand their family that way with all the pitfalls, but I think just being really educated and knowing and really doing your research and speaking to people firsthand. And if someone says, you know, it's always like, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Still, information can be hard to come by.
We base so much truth on what we can read and find online. And then you're so judged and critiqued if you don't know that it's not the truth. But it's like, how can you know sometimes?
To try and prevent illegal adoptions, international regulations were established in 1993 by members of the Hague Convention.
Several countries have included illegal adoptions in their anti-trafficking legislation, but the U.S. has not.
Knowing who to vote for as an independent can be hard and confusing at times. That's why the Clean Elections Commission held the We the Voters Conference. It featured the Political Party Perspective Panel, bringing together leaders from all 4 of Arizona's major political parties. Cronkite News reporter Andrew Christensen was there as the discussions became a little heated.
Leaders of the Republican, Democrat, Green, and Libertarian parties gathered at the Phoenix Convention Center, starting the panel explaining what their parties stand for.
Let people control their own retirement. Let them figure out how to retire for themselves. Replace government welfare with private charity and cut taxes and government spending.
According to the Arizona Secretary of State website, Libertarians make up less than 1% of voters. That's about the same as the Green Party.
So if you value peace and if you value policies and candidates that want to address the climate crisis without the outside influence of money in politics, then you're a green voter.
The state's 2 main parties, the Republicans and Democrats, are fighting for the majority. As of July 1st, less than 2% divides those two, with Republicans holding a slight lead. And the 2 party leaders fought it out on stage as well.
Another reason why people are going to vote? Because Donald Trump is manipulating the White House and has aligned himself with ISIS and Saudi Arabia.
I have to say that is not true.
But just let me say that the most important thing that we can do today is vote for civility, vote for a president who's not going to align himself with the most dangerous foreign nations that are the reason why we had 9/11.
The president has not aligned himself with ISIS. That is a total and complete fabrication.
With a debate for another time.
Yes, we have to put that out there. You can't have them filming saying
I want to let Amy have her say.
Despite arguments that may break out between parties, the Clean Elections Commission hopes to inform voters before they fill out their ballots.
If you are an educated voter, if you're an informed voter, you know how to get your ballot. You understand the issues and the candidates that are on your ballot, and so you can feel confident in the choices that you're making. And so voter education is really critical to ensuring participation in our democracy.
In Phoenix, Andrew Christensen, Cronkite News.
The We the Voters Conference also featured sessions on the upcoming primary, how the media influences elections, and how to have a civil conversation about politics.
College IDs could be used as identification at the polls, but only if universities are willing to make some changes.
As it stands right now, those IDs do not meet the requirements.
Cronkite News reporter Peter Gong reports on what would need to be done. Peter?
The issue for the IDs to be acceptable, the student's address must be on the card, and that's not currently on any of the IDs at the 3 state universities. A footnote in the draft of the Elections Procedures Manual states that student ID cards from a public college or university are government-issued IDs and can be accepted, but only if it meets the voter ID requirements.
Student ID must have a name, your photo, and your address. So we want to avoid any misconception that a student ID that lacks those three elements is sufficient. They are not.
Bordeaux, the Election Services Director for the Secretary of State's office, stated that no rules are being changed to the voter ID law, but there is a clarification of what's acceptable. During the 2016 election, students waited long lines at the polling place. Many are advocating for student ID cards to be accepted for voting purposes.
A lot of students who didn't have that driver's license are trying to figure out how you can mix and match these different documents and usually aren't super familiar with what is going to count.
Right now, student ID cards from ASU, U of A, and NAU do not have addresses on them which would not meet the voter ID law criteria. It would be up to Arizona's public colleges and universities to update the ID card, something ASU explained in a statement would be challenging. Many ASU student IDs are tied to bank accounts, which raises security concerns if addresses were to be printed on those ID cards, and the fact that we are dealing with a highly mobile population which would require continuous updates to student IDs. While student ID cards can't be used for voter identification at this time, Doe has a message to students who still want to vote.
Students should get out. Students who are residents of Arizona, they should register. They should get involved. We have an important election coming up.
If you want to make sure you have the right documents to bring to the polls, you can go to azcleanelections.gov and go to the ID at the poll section to take the interactive quiz to determine if you have sufficient ID to vote this November. Live in the broadcast center, Peter Gahn, Cronkite News.
In the past, Arizona has been known to be a reliably red state. However, these next elections could change that. For the first time since 1996, we could go either way in the 2020 presidential election. Cronkite News reporter Mariah Gallegos found out why the possible shift is happening.
Arizona is actually considered a toss-up state and could be one of the tipping point states of who wins the White House in 2020.
Mike Noble is the chief of research at OH Predictive Insights, and he says because President Trump previously won in Arizona by the slimmest margin of 3.5 points, the next election is uncertain. The latest numbers from political polling supports that.
So you see the biggest parts of where Republicans are hurting right now are among 18 to 34-year-olds, Hispanics, which is an emerging large demographic here, also suburban voters that we're seeing. So again, among those moderates, those folks in the middle, those moderates and leaners, again, they're just not going the GOP's way, which they used to go their way.
And because of the disadvantage Republicans have, Noble expects both Democrats and Republicans to open their wallets on advertising.
What you can expect is an historic amount of money being spent in Arizona, which, funny, interesting fact, last election, the midterms, it was a historic amount of money spent in Arizona elections. Just on broadcast alone was about $127 million spent. We're projected to see, just in traditional broadcast, $250 million, so almost double that.
Cronkite News received this statement from the Arizona Democratic Party about their take on the race. After a long string of broken promises from Donald Trump and Arizona Republicans, Arizonans are ready to make a change in 2020. We are feeling confident about the year ahead, amidst a strong fundraising year and with an increasingly energized electorate. Over the course of the next year, Democrats will continue to highlight the issues that are most important to Arizonans, making the case that we're the party that will make Washington and the state legislature start working for every Arizonan, not just powerful special interest and the wealthy few. The Republican Party gave Cronkite News a statement saying every state in the Southwest is competitive. It goes on to say, Every vote in Arizona needs to be fought for and earned. No one can take the state for granted, and that's why we gotta work so early in this cycle, laying the organizational groundwork. We have had field operatives on the ground throughout the state for months, and President Trump is personally committed to ensuring our volunteers have the resources they need to reach into every corner of the state to contact, persuade, and mobilize voters for victory.
We're in probably the most unique or most interesting time in Arizona's history when it comes to Arizona's implication on the national map.
The Senate race is heating up. OH Predictive took a look at how much money the candidates have. Democrat Mark Kelly has $9.5 million on hand, while Republican Martha McSally, who was appointed to that office and hopes to stay, has $5.6 million, and Republican Daniel McCarthy has just $71,000 on hand. As to how fast the candidates are spending that money, McSally has the highest burn rate at 44%, followed by McCarthy with 40%, and Kelly's spending rate is about 32%. The 2020 Census office opened in Phoenix today. The Bureau says it's making changes to ensure an accurate count, especially of Native Americans and other underserved communities.
Reporter Jenna Iannone attended a news conference this morning to learn more about those changes. Jenna?
In the 2010 census, the Bureau says that racial and ethnic minorities were severely undercounted. Only 4.9% of Native populations were counted, and to do a better job, they've made some changes.
This year, there's a new focus to the 2020 census, making sure that underserved communities are counted accurately. The data collection process has evolved, using a combination of new technology and good old door-to-door hand deliveries. U.S. Census Bureau's Timothy Olson says that the key to a successful count is persistence, along with a little something extra.
In many areas, we are doing a slightly different style of enumeration rather than the post office. Mailing invitations, we are hand delivering to each address.
Here in Arizona, extra outreach will be handled by 25 community chairs assigned to specific communities and areas.
We'll have 16 subcommittees. Each of those committees will be communicating with their own individual communities, whether it's the Latino community, the tribal community, whatever that is. And it's so important that they're able to tell us how we need to communicate, where we communicate, how we can best reach the people in their community.
The census will begin to be distributed to all communities starting in January. The form will consist of 7 basic questions. Citizens will fill in their name, sex, age, family or roommates, relationship to that person, and race. We sat down with one Native American leader who explained why the 2010 census count was off.
So from a long history and a very negative history with the federal government, I think a lot of American Indians have a huge distrust.
Addressing these concerns of distrust and safety is a major focus this year. The Bureau is now turning the initiative over to the trusted leaders of smaller communities to explain why responding to the questionnaire matters.
I need you to respond. It's going to affect our future for a decade. It affects how we're represented, and it's safe. Please self-respond.
The census count ends next August, and after that, local governments will get their share of an estimated $650 billion based on the population. In the Broadcast Center, I'm Jenny Iannone for Cronkite News.
A field hearing on voting rights and election administration took place at Phoenix College this morning. The evidence from the hearing will be used by Congress as they evaluate parts of the Voting Rights Act, which was suspended by the United States Supreme Court. Cronkite News reporter Delaney White was at the hearing. Delaney?
There were 2 panels today, one focused exclusively on Native American voting rights. Some of the problems discussed included access to polling locations, lack of address for voting materials, difficulties reaching the polls, and voter ID issues. Representative Marcia Fudge, subcommittee chair, spoke with me about the purpose of today's event.
Today we're here to address what we've been addressing across this country, which is to be sure
that every single American has the unfettered right to vote. We know that there have been some issues, some lawsuits, some problems in the state of Arizona, and so we're here to hear people's stories so they can tell us what is happening so that we can try to correct it as members of Congress.
I want to take a quick moment to recognize Congressman Gallego as well. He's one of the leading sponsors of H.R. 1694, the Native American Voting Rights Act, which I believe after this hearing, everyone will agree we need to pass in Congress and send to the President's desk. I'm proud to be one of the original co-sponsors of the bill. In fact, we have 5 House members from Arizona who are co-sponsors of the bill. I'm hopeful that our 2 U.S. senators will take a look at the companion bill in the Senate and add their names as co-sponsors as well.
Other members of Arizona's delegation were also at the hearing, including Republican Congresswoman Debbie Lesko and Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego and Raul Grijalva. Today's hearing was one of several events being held across the country to address election oversight. In the Broadcast Center, Delaney White, Cronkite News.
The Report, a movie about an investigation of the CIA's detention and interrogation program created after 9/11, highlights the journalistic process Daniel J. Jones went through to uncover the truth about what was hidden from the American public.
Cronkite News reporter Delaney White spoke to director Scott Burns and Daniel J. Jones himself about the film.
After 9/11, everyone was scared.
Possible hijacked plane.
Scared it might happen again.
Obvious terrorist attack.
It was my second day of grad school. Next day, I changed all my classes to national security.
Morning, Dan.
Morning, Senator.
Have you seen the story today in the New York Times?
Evidently, the CIA destroyed tapes of interrogations of al-Qaeda detainees.
I want to find out what was on the tapes, why they were destroyed.
This was a CIA program that was created after September 11th to detain suspected terrorists and interrogate them, and it involved the use of torture by the U.S. government. We spent 7 years compiling a report that's, again, 6,700 pages, 38,000 footnotes to the CIA's own records to really tell the story of what really happened, because there was a cover-up and CIA misinformed the president about what they were doing, they misinformed the Congress, and they misinformed the Department of Justice, and we were correcting that record.
Director Scott Burns spoke about the parts of the journalistic process he wanted to focus on in this film.
What I really wanted to highlight was the fact that Dan looked at 6 million documents, sorted through all of this, and was able to put a story together that people can read.
Daniel Jones, played by Adam Driver, spoke about the importance of fact-checking and how it played a role in the findings of his report.
If we couldn't corroborate information, we weren't 100% sure it was true, it didn't go in the report. And then we had people look at the report while we were writing it, something called red teaming, where people are very critical, as critical as they can be about your report. And then you hear their suggestions, you hear their thoughts, and you change the report and you make it stronger. Well, the report itself has 3 big findings. One is that torture is ineffective. The second is that the CIA continually misled the President of the United States and the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, as well as the Department of Justice, about the nature of the program and the effectiveness of the program. And the third is that it was grossly mismanaged and needed oversight from the legislative branch.
Though the movie is focused on past events, director Scott Burns found the theme relates to our current political climate.
I think we are living through a moment that, feels like a crisis of accountability. And what I think is important for people to take away from this is that our system, as flawed as it may be, really can work, but it requires people to behave with the integrity and the rigor with which Dan behaved. And in interviewing, a lot of the senators who are involved in this story, what they all said to me was because Dan did his job that thoroughly, it forced them to do their job and to stand up and do the right thing. And I hope that lands with people.
The Report is in theaters everywhere, starting today. What happens during a 911 call can be stressful for police communication operators.
That's why the city of Phoenix created a space for dispatchers to decompress.
Reporter Andrew Christensen shows us around the quiet room. Andrew?
I went to the Phoenix Police Department to get an inside look at the quiet room that is dedicated to police communication officers and learned how silence can impact mental health. Silence. Part of a new therapeutic room Phoenix PD has dedicated to communications operators to help them deal with stress after they take 911 calls. Phoenix Mayor Kate Gallego attended a dedication ceremony to thank operators for their service.
They save lives in our community. We are better off because of the important work they do, and today is a wonderful opportunity for us to say thank you.
Police Chief Jerry Williams described the transformation of what used to be a copy room and talked about the difference the quiet room will make.
When you go into the call center can be very busy and very stressful for my employees. And just that chance and that opportunity just to take a couple of seconds, as you mentioned, Mayor, just to go in and just take a little breather and take a little me time is going to make a tremendous difference.
Phoenix PD contacted the Rotary Club to make the quiet room possible, asking them how they could bring their mission of peace to communications operators.
I believe that every act of service, whether it's by a communication officer or by one of us here in this room, it's an act of peace. Peace is a big deal to us.
Communications operator Olga Valenzuela says that she used to cope with stress after a 911 call by having someone walk with her outside. But she says she's thankful to have a more private space.
Kind of helps us to kind of go over the call that we went and kind of decompress a little bit and kind of like, okay, take a big breath and okay, let's move on and go back to work.
Currently, Phoenix PD has more than 250 communications officers and is looking to hire 25 more. In the Media Center, Andrew Christensen, Cronkite News.
That's it for this special edition of Cronkite News. Thanks for joining us. For top Arizona stories anytime, go to cronkitenews.azpbs.org.